Aloha kako. Thank you so much for coming to the 2021 HLA annual spring meeting. I'm so happy to be here today to welcome you to our meeting and to introduce our speaker, Dr. Akiemi Glenn from the Pōpolo project. She's going to be speaking to us about her organization, and then we're going to have a facilitated Q&A about systemic racism in Hawaii and how it developed here in our islands, and also how librarians and libraries are uniquely positioned to make meaningful changes around these challenges that our society continues to grapple with. But before we dive in, I just wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge with respect the Indigenous spaces from which we're all calling in from. 2 years ago, we were able to meet in person. Last year it was canceled. So Zoom is the next best thing. And I know we're all calling in from all different spaces in Hawaii. And I think even across the sea, there might be an attendee here today from across the Pacific Ocean. So in particular for me, I'm in the ili of Waipahu, the ahupua'a of Hei'ia, on the windward side of Oahu. And I just want to take a moment to be thankful for the original inhabitants known today as Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, and to thank the Native Hawaiians who came before us, who with their knowledge and expertise created and built a sustainable environment for future generations. So at this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Akiemi Glenn. Again, she's the executive director from the Pōpolo project. She holds a PhD and MA in linguistics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a BA in linguistics from New York University. She is a scholar and community worker who specializes in studying culture and facilitating community change in large and small scales. And she is an artist and a filmmaker and a cultural practitioner with genealogical ties to the forest and coastal regions now known as North Carolina and Virginia. And Akiemi's work and research and curation involving indigenous linguistic revitalization and community-based cultural education really centers on the experience of diaspora and creating radical connections for profound change. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Akiemi to tell us about her organization, and also and our business meeting will follow after that. But thank you so much, Dr. Glenn, for taking your time with us. We'd love to hear from you. So if you, one more thing, if you want to change your speaker view to your view to speaker view, because that way you'll see Dr. Glenn speaking, and then I'm going to turn my camera off. And then when she shares her slides, you'll really be able to see her. So thank you, Dr. Glenn.
Mahalo, Jenny. Thank you so much for having me and for that introduction. It's always kind of funny, I do a lot of different work these days, and it's always interesting to kind of hear my bio flash by. I'm sure some of you are wondering, why is a linguist doing this work? And I hope to kind of give you a little bit of an overview, not just of myself, but how I've come to this work and some of the work that we're doing here in Hawaii now. As Jenny mentioned, I'm the executive director and the founder of the Pōpolo project. And we are a small organization, relatively small organization, relatively new here, based on Oahu, but working across the state of Hawaii. And our mission is to change what it means to be Black here in Hawaii. And I'll share a few slides with you folks just to talk about some of the work that we've been doing, in particular around concepts of race and talking about race in Hawaii. When we started the Pōpolo project almost 5 years ago now, talking about race and racism was not at the top of our mind. Really what we were interested in doing was creating spaces for people in our small Black community here. We're about 3.6% of the total resident population here in Hawaii, those of us who have ancestry that ties us back to the continent of Africa. We're a pretty small community, but as we were talking to folks and hearing that there was this desire to be in community with each other, to have places to practice our cultures together, and just kind of checking in on our different, but sometimes shared experiences of living in these islands, there were a lot of things that kept coming up, and probably not a surprise to anyone on this call, issues of race and concepts of race that do show up in Hawaii in some ways that are difficult to talk about, sometimes covert, and experiences and ideas around race that are imported from other places, in particular North America, and the fact that there's a US presence in Hawaii that is relatively new in the long span of things. So one of the pieces of work that we've been doing the last few years has been training in the community around this kind of program that we call Understanding Race and Belonging in Hawaii. And while it's not solely focused on the experiences of Black people here in Hawaii, it's really crucial to understanding how race has operated here, that we kind of enter from our, community lens. So I'd like to share with you just a couple a little more than a couple. I'd like to share with you a few slides that kind of start talking about that particular history. And we'll share with you why the Pōpolo Project is doing this work and why we find it to be our responsibility to kind of push some of this conversations and the pieces of this conversation forward at any time, but certainly the last year and even the last few weeks have really made it imperative for us to do that. And as I'm talking, you'll see, and I'll mention that a number of the pieces that we're trying to bring forward in our community could not be done without going into the archives and without unearthing stories that have been silenced or marginalized or made inaccessible to people. And when we wrap and have a little bit more of a talk story vibe for this conversation today, I hope that we'll be able to talk about how the work that you folks do as information professionals, librarians and archivists and folks who are helping our community protect and also access information is vital to us actually bringing forward a clear vision of the history and the present of Hawaii, and also helping us chart what a just future will look like for these islands. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. This always takes a little work here. Let's see, I hope that you can see this. Is everybody able to see my screen? I hope so.
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
Great. Well, this cover image here, you might recognize. I don't know if you've seen this before, but this is a photo that was taken by a photographer named 𝗥𝗰𝗶𝗀𝗃. And this is on Mauna Kea. And this image is one that I've used several times, and I find it really compelling because when we're talking about racism in Hawaii, we often are baffled or don't know exactly what to point to. It feels different here because this is Hawaii and not North America, where many of us have been trained to have these conversations. But I love this image because in the foreground there's the hand of a Black activist who lives on the Big Island, has been very involved in the movement to protect Mauna Kea for some time. And I talked to him after this image was circulating, and he said for him, he saw the work to challenge racism in his home. He's from Kentucky originally. He found that the work to challenge racism around the world had a special import here in Hawaii, and that connecting the ways that people and land and our histories have been oppressed and erased to him seemed really, really accessible here. And it gave him a lot of strength to continue to fight this fight on a global scale. So I love this image. It's an image of people celebrating and supporting each other. And I think really trying to imagine a different future for Hawaii, and in so doing, a different future for the world. So let's see. Talk that I like to use. It's a little bit wordy, but I think it's important because this is a very complex social phenomenon. When we talk about race, what we're talking about is a construction of stigmas and divisions, categories essentially, that allows certain groups of people to have power, and that power is usually backed up by a nation state. This is also the process of racialization, making a group of people into a race, is also a process of projecting some kind of identity on that group of people connected to a social practice, culture, and sometimes their phenotype, what they look like. And this again is always for some purpose, and that purpose is to accrue power over the group that's deemed subordinate. And you can imagine through this process unfolding that different material realities come out of that. So whether those are what people look like, or whether those are the kinds of access to wealth and power individuals in our community have. Race is constructed, and so it means that humans created this notion, but race is also real in that it shapes human relationships and people's access to the resources to live their lives. So it's important for us to understand that while race has been made by humans and can be unmade by humans, it's going to take a concerted effort for us to be able to move that along. When we talk about race, it's also important to see that there's a very close relationship between race and our economic system. So I mentioned the nation state and power, but money also goes along with this. And so being able to tell the story of race anywhere in the world, but especially here in Hawaii, without talking about the economic benefits to some groups of people, gives us an incomplete story. So you'll see as we go that there's some really sometimes shocking bits of information that are only explainable if we understand the close relationship between a concept of race and the economic system that we live under. Also, this idea of settler colonialism, which I'm sure many people in this group have heard about and probably read and studied about as well, but also understanding that this is a global structure that comes out of this notion of racial capitalism, where a group of people comes from some other place, has power, money, extracts money from the place, and replaces the indigenous people and creates a new identity. I often, at this point in the presentation, remind everyone that the fact that we're having this conversation in English is evidence of settler colonialism here in Hawaii, a place that has had a longstanding indigenous language and it's still spoken, still practiced. But the fact that we presume that in professional contexts we will speak English is one of the pieces of evidence that settler colonialism is happening all around us. And in some ways that even despite our intentions, we continue to participate in structures that uphold settler colonialism here in Hawaii. It's important to understand these kinds of definitions because often we will abstract concepts of like racism and think, I'm a good person, I'm not participating in racism, I'm not a racist person, but realizing that these structures are much bigger than individuals and have us on the very intimate level, at the level of speaking English in this conversation, participating and reifying and restructuring systems of oppression, whether we know what they are and their origins or not. So I always like to say this because it's important, especially for me as a Black person, as a person of color, as a person who is a product of these histories of settler colonialism. As Jenny mentioned in my bio, my family and my genealogy goes back to the coastal areas of Virginia and North Carolina. And I have a background that's indigenous and African and European, among other things. Some of us are products of these histories. At the same time, we participate in them. All of us are caught up in these systems and continue them. So it's especially important when we think about institutional change to think about the ways that we forward some of these oppressive ideas without necessarily understanding how our direct participation makes them stronger. And so then finally, this idea of white supremacy, which I think people are saying more now. It's a challenging phrase for some people because we often revert to an idea of, white supremacist groups that use overt violence in advocating for their vision of a world with white people, a racial category of white people at the top. And it's important to understand that white supremacy is a very complex social formation, and it's not just about violence meted out by the Ku Klux Klan or groups that directly espouse wanting to harm people of color. It's a belief in the inherent superiority of people, mostly from Europe, but people who are coded as white, and people who are perceived in proximity to them, their cultures and the institutions that they believe that they have built. And also this belief that white people should be prioritized and should have control over our institutions and our politics. And this often expresses itself in violent ways, as I mentioned, but sometimes in hostile behaviors towards people of color to recenter themselves or to meaningfully participate in social and civic life. And we see this in contemporary America in a lot of different formats. There's a real kind of new recontextualization of white supremacy as demographic change is happening across the US and around the world. And as we start to see who's in power changing. And I think Hawaii has a lot to kind of offer the larger world to think through what it might look like to have a more pluralistic society. But it's important, especially for today, to recognize that Hawaii also is grappling with notions of white supremacy, racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and race at its core. I also always like to remind us that yes, Hawaii is different. It's very specific. It has its own history. It's different in a lot of ways from North America. But a lot of the ideas and the values that have underpinned the United States experience here come from racist and racial and white supremacist values. And so I often will remind folks in the audience when I'm talking about this stuff of this Samoan proverb, this 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗲𝗃, that says, 𝗖𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃. The form changes, but the underlying principles remain. So when we're talking about race and racism in Hawaii, it might look really different, but if the same ideas are there, and we'll talk about what some of those core ideas are. Those same ideas are there, the harm can still be done. And I think that as we look at the reality of our community, where there's tremendous wealth inequality, where we've had all kinds of violence, whether it's at the hands of police or vigilantes in our community, impacting some of the most vulnerable people, we have to grapple with the ways that this form has changed, but the underlying principles are there, and they still continue to replicate themselves in new environments unless we root them out. So one of the ways that we can start to see the racial reality of Hawaii is looking at patterns of representation. So our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population in Hawaii, by different counts and different ways that people self-identify, is around 30% in 2019. Our Asian community is around 35%. We don't necessarily see this represented in institutional levels, right? When we look at gender and race in leadership across a number of institutions in Hawaii, government agencies, nonprofit, public utilities, we see that there's an overrepresentation of people who are identified as white and people who identify as men. So even though white men are not the majority of people in Hawaii, they are in positions of power. And that's not to say that those individuals are people who are there because they are racist or because they've hurt other people. But it's to say that patterns of representation show us that structures of power and access do not mirror what we see in our larger community. So one of the ways that we see that is something that a colleague at UH Law School, Charles Lawrence, has written about as local kind implicit bias, where you see a differential kind of engagement with the legal system here, where people who are racialized or presumed to be a part of a certain racial category here in Hawaii, that's often Pacific Islanders, especially Micronesian folks and Native Hawaiians, have a different experience in terms of the severity of their sentencing and the rate at which the community is incarcerated. So when we actually look at those data, it tells a very different picture than what we often talk about as kind of a racial paradise of Hawaii. We have to start asking some different questions. And then we see now, certainly unfolding during the COVID pandemic, racialized impacts of access to healthcare. And we have been seeing for a long time, and will likely see going forward, racialized impacts of climate change, which means that certain communities will bear the brunt of climate change. We're already seeing that as people throughout the Pacific are moving as their islands become inundated. So it's important for us when we talk about these big ideas to also bring them to the ground and think about how this is actually playing out in our everyday lives here in Hawaii, and things that we normalize and things that we expect to see and things that we can actually make an intervention on. So one of the things that often comes up when we talk about race is that we think that it's about what someone looks like. So looking at me on this Zoom screen, I don't know how big I am in your view, but you can probably make some guesses about where my ancestors come from, right? Because I have a certain color brown, my hair is a certain texture, and my face is a certain shape. You can make guesses about who I am, right? Make guesses about how I've shown up in this world. And ideas about my history inform how you might engage with me in a daily interaction. This is something that happens on a large scale because it's happened over time, and these are cultural ideas. One of the things that comes up quite often, especially when we talk about race in the Pacific, is this idea of who looks local, who looks Black, who looks like they live in Hawaii. And part of this is referring to this larger idea of the phenotype as being a signifier of someone's intelligence, aptitude, morality, and all of those things. And so I just want to share with you a few images that that I have used in situations where we talk about how ideas about phenotype show up here in Hawaii. So So this gentleman is in a portrait from the 1860s, and I often will ask people in the audience where they think he's from, just looking at his face. And it's been very rare that I've had someone guess, correctly where he's from. But when I say 1860s, he looks like an older gentleman. He's wearing a kind of Western style top from what you can see. People often will guess, and I think also because I'm the one showing this slide, people will often guess that he is an enslaved person from the Americas, and will make up all kinds of interesting stories about who this person is, why he's posing for this photo. Part of that is because we have seen photos of enslaved people from this time period that have this kind of sepia tone. You might see someone wearing a garment like this. But also part of the story is that they're looking at this man's face. They're looking at the features of his hair, the shape of his face and facial features there, and making a decision about what they've seen in the past and how they understand phenotype and the expression of his genes to signify something about who he is and his social history. When I show this fuller version of his portrait, people sometimes kind of revisit where they think he might be from. This man is a chief from Fiji, and that story is something we can get into maybe some other time, but he's posing for a photo here in one of the early encounters with the British there. And so it kind of reconfigures this idea of who this man might be, this idea that he's probably not enslaved. He's a person who has power in his community. But the racial idea primes the viewer at the very first to imagine him in a position of subjugation, probably someone who's experienced violence. And it's important for us to point this out because as we come into the Pacific, ideas of race that were developed in the Atlantic world came here too. And so as Europeans and Americans later came into the Pacific, they brought ideas about people that look like this gentleman that they had developed over many centuries. And a lot of our contemporary social and political situation is grown out of that. So I'm going to show you a few objectionable images from the archives, but I think they're important for us to see. This is a political cartoon from the 1840s talking about the conflict between the United States and the UK in terms of what they wanted to have in terms of a relationship with the Kingdom of Hawaii. You'll see Hawaii is in the middle of this image depicted in a very racialized, very racist style version of a dark-skinned person. So here Hawaii is being depicted as a Black person who, by the drawing is kind of wearing this put together minstrel style attire. His top hat is crushed. It looks like someone who may be experiencing developmental challenges, but most importantly, they're drawing on this visual history that readers would be able to recognize. Though many people in Hawaii today wouldn't think of Hawaiians as Black, this was a part of the racial shorthand that was circulating for some time before the coup against the government in 1893 to prime Americans to think about Hawaii and its own self-governance as illegitimate. So you see, England on the left and America on the right, trying to kind of think about what they would like to do, how they'd like to carve up this savage, essentially. Many people know about the transatlantic slave trade. This is something that, I'm sure everyone on this call has a recollection of maybe an image like this, where you see the massive human trafficking operation that lasted for several centuries and brought a lot of people of African descent to the Americas. A lot of people don't know about the history of blackbirding, and this is an image that refers to post-1865, the kidnapping and trafficking of Pacific Islanders, people who looked like the man in the previous slide, the chiefly man sitting and having his portrait taken. People were kidnapped from across the Solomon Islands in the area of so-called Melanesia and taken to places like Northern Australia to work on sugarcane plantations. Some folks were taken as far away as Peru to work on cotton plantations to compete with the failing US market after US cotton tanked post-Civil War. So there's a lot of history here. And if you haven't heard much about Blackbird, I encourage you to learn this history. It's very relevant to Hawaii. And I'll mention a couple of points that you might want to follow up on. But these are some of the people from the Solomon Islands who were trafficked to Australia, where this practice remained of having people in bondage and working in sugar till 1905, when it was finally outlawed. Some of those folks were able to return home. Many people died and many people remained. And so now in Australia, they're called South Sea Islanders, and some of their communities are still there. But this is a really interesting connection, right? So the ending of slavery in the US in 1865 with the conclusion of the American Civil War shifted the need for unfree labor. And so one of the first places that people came from the US and from the Americas was to the Pacific, because there were humans here who were relatively vulnerable, and because racial ideas from the Atlantic world were already animated in the ways that Europeans and Americans were engaging with indigenous people here. So it's important for us to know this history. This is one that when I do talk about blackbirding and that history during the mid-1860s, people are often really surprised that they have never heard about. This is just a still from an event that our organization did at the Honolulu Museum of Art a couple of years ago with the author Ta-Nehisi Coates. And in the advance of that conversation that I had with Mr. Coates, we showed a short film done by a Solomon Islander Australian called Blackbird. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out. It's very short, it's maybe 20 minutes or so, but it tells this story of, and really humanizes the story. And there were, you can see it's a full house that night. I think there were maybe like 5 people who had heard about blackbirding before they came into the conversation that evening. And it's just a reminder that we have an opportunity as people who know these stories and who have access to the documentation and can have relationships with others who are making this information available. We have a responsibility and opportunity to make sure that things that get hidden in the archives or things that are hard to put our hands on in the general kind of public world do have a place to come to light, because it helps people contextualize their own experiences, reckon with the truth of what's happened in the past, but also make plans and dream what a better future could look like for all of us. I mentioned cotton plantations in Peru being a destination for people who were trafficked and enslaved. But it's interesting, this photo is from the 1840s, and this is from my colleague 𝗣𝗰𝗶𝗀𝗲, who is a historian and has spent a lot of time in archives, and some of you may have worked with Guy over the years. I know he spends a lot of time in Hawaii. He dug up this image of an Oahu cotton field from the 1840s. And it's really important, I think, for us as we think about race in Hawaii and how things have played out over the last 125 years, especially, to understand that there was a close relationship, thinking back to this concept of racial capitalism, there's a close relationship between people coming to Hawaii in the post-contact period and seeing this place as possibly exploitable for economic gain. And they were looking at crops, agricultural crops, and other kinds of extractive industries that would be well suited to the climate and to the location. And so sugar, was one of the big crops that we all know about, and pineapples too, right, in the recent years. But there were lots of different crops that were tried out here. And one was cotton. And this is in the 1840s when there was still slavery in the US. And so there were different ideas floated around this time period of, what would it look like for us to bring slaves to work cotton here in Hawaii? And some of you may know that in 1852, the Hawaiian Kingdom, having had some of these interactions with foreigners who came with these ideas and were looking for these economic prospects, the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1852 actually put in its constitution that it would not accept slavery here, and it would not support people bringing enslaved people to Hawaii. Of course, the Constitution changed over many years, and with the overthrow of the government, a lot of those things went out the window. But it's important to note that people who were trying to make this a go here were met with opposition. And this is in a larger context of human trafficking happening throughout the Pacific. So the Hawaiian Kingdom was well aware of what was happening and was very concerned about making sure that that was not something that would befall their citizens at the time. Now, that's not to say that the labor practices that have did stick here for just or equitable or for everyone's best benefit. But I think it's important to understand that the ʻaliʻi and other folks in leadership in Hawaii were well aware of what was happening around the world, especially with unfree labor. So I'm sure everyone on this call knows quite a lot about the overthrow. I'm sure you're all well aware and are learning more, but it's also really interesting to make this particular point. So we know that during the immediate aftermath of the overthrow, that the US Congress sent people here to investigate what had happened and to determine whether or not it was legal and whether it was in the US's best interest to incorporate Hawaii into its larger and now expanding empire. The Morgan Report, which was the second report on what had happened here, the coup against the government, was led by John Tyler Morgan, who was the US Senator from Alabama. And he was also, he happened to be the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama. Interestingly, and I encourage you if you haven't encountered the Morgan Report or the Blunt Report basically said, this is not legitimate. This overthrow is not legitimate. It may not be in the US's best interest. The Morgan Report came out a year later after Morgan came and spent some time here and concluded that it was inappropriate for people of a darker hue to be ruling themselves and that the US had a moral imperative to take over Hawaii at some point. It's interesting that that document, which was one of the pieces, the kind of legal bases for Hawaii becoming part of the US, was authored by someone who was very publicly and avowedly a white supremacist. And so while many of us don't know these histories in our day-to-day, it's important for us to think about what this knowledge might help us contextualize about how Hawaii has developed in the time since 1894. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but similar to the image that I showed you previously, the political cartoon, we see in the aftermath of the overthrow, a racialization of the Queen Liliuokalani. One thing that I'll note here, and you might have seen it in the previous slide that I showed you with the US and the UK trying to carve up Hawaii, is that in drawing on this idea of Hawaii as interchangeable with Blackness and the same ideas of Black subordination and inferiority, we see this depiction of Queen Liliuokalani that draws on racist depictions of Black women, including in every one of these images, she's wearing giant gold hoop earrings, which we know are not traditionally a part of Hawaiian attire. The Queen never wore those, but it was a racial shorthand to link her with these unflattering images of Black women and Black people more generally. And these are things that, again, are not, we don't want to spend too much time looking at them because they are so harmful and racist, but it's important that, especially as folks who are helping organize information for our community, that we at least know that these kinds of images and engagements exist, because it, again, helps us understand and contextualize some of what's happening today. This is an image from Iolani Palace on July 4th, 1895. With the installation of Sanford Dole as the President of the Republic. A number of the laws and regulations that we're still living with and thinking through, and especially policy around land, come from this early time period, this kind of first move after the overthrow of the government and move to install the Republic government and then the territorial government. And I always like to point out to people that we have to think about the larger context of what's happening around the world. We are talking about 1893 in Hawaii, which in the 90s, this was the fever pitch of racism and racist violence in the US after Reconstruction had failed and before there were a lot of reforms. This is the beginning of the Jim Crow era. This is when we're starting to see lynching become a common practice. And so while that same kind of violence did not necessarily show up here at the same time, though there was violence here post-overthrow, the threat of that violence was always there, because Hawaii did have these historical ties and relationships with people from the US, including white supremacist folks. And it's important too to understand that some of the aftermath of the overthrow has been ongoing, right? So this is an advertisement from a newspaper that was circulating in Oregon in the 1920s. There had been a concerted effort to bring Anglo-Saxons to Hawaii. Sanford Dole had been a part of that. himself writing letters and op-eds and other things to get more people that he thought were of a higher caliber to come to Hawaii to displace the indigenous population and the growing immigrant worker population. So again, this is a classic settler colonial move. And this is an ad asking white people to move to Hawaii so that they would be able to have access to land. And you can see in this ad, they're referred to as desirable immigrants. And this was in contrast to Asian immigrants who were coming in at the time and indigenous people who are already here. It's also interesting to think about the fact that we think of Hawaii as this remote place and very different from North America, and that's true. But the eyes of the world have been on Hawaii for a long time. And this is a quote from Frederick Douglass just a year before he died on the occasion of the overthrow of the Queen. He was thinking about it and understood that the stories and the blackening, as he calls it, of her character, I think that's a double entendre there, because he means it in the sense of besmirching her character, but also the way that she's being associated with Black people. He understands that this is part of a larger effort and a cultural value of creating the pretext, but also the justification for the domination of people over time. And this is another thing that came to my desk from someone who was working in an archive, who was reading a collection of essays and speeches by Douglass, who was very surprised to hear that he mentioned the Queen and Hawaii, and so shared it with me. So even in my work, I'm constantly learning and being aided by people who are spending the time in the archives and with their antennas up, thinking about how they can make these connections. And so I wanted to share this particular quote with you as well. I'm just going to spend a few more minutes just thinking about how some of these histories of race in Hawaii come into our contemporary experience. And I'll use just a couple of examples from the communities that I'm a part of here. So people of African descent in Hawaii, I think we're around 3.6%. We're about 4% of the total resident population. So relatively small numbers in a place that has extreme diversity. And in this 4%, we're including people who identify primarily as African-American, Black, of African descent, and people who acknowledge ancestry that connects them to the African continent. So pretty small numbers. If you've seen me speak other places, I often will talk about this particular set of data. This is a set of data about live births in Hawaii by the race of the mother, the race or ethnicity of the mother. This is from 2013. I know there's some updated data that look a little bit better, but for the purposes of this illustration, I think it's great for us to look at this. So I mentioned that our community is around 3.6%, almost 4% of the total residents here. So you see the little red sliver, Black, that is 3%. So the number of Black women who give birth as a proportion of total mothers who give birth is what you would expect. It's pretty proportionate. I'm also going to ask you to pay attention to the purple slice, Samoan, 2.8%. And again, Samoan people are around 2%, 2.5% of our total resident population. So again, it looks pretty proportional. So these two very small groups of people are showing up in our maternal health data pretty much as we would expect. This is a different, little bit of a different scale, but what this chart is showing is the mortality rate for children, again, looking at children by the race and ethnicity of the mother during the same period as the pie chart that I just showed you. You'll probably notice that the biggest bar is Black women, Black babies, or babies born to Black women. And then the second highest bar is Samoan. So what we're looking at is a very high mortality rate for women, or the children of women who identify as Black or identified as Black and Samoan. Usually when we see these kinds of infant mortality rates in other places outside of Hawaii, and even here to some extent, these data are explained away by saying Black people inhabit a lower socioeconomic status. And so there are all these other kinds of crunching things that go into this. It might be that people are not seeking prenatal care, for example, or it might be that they are living in poverty and not getting adequate nutrition. The interesting and striking thing about this particular set of data for Hawaii, however, is that when we look at our Black community on average in comparison to other Black communities in the US, alone. Our community is actually relatively wealthy now, and doesn't mean that we're the richest people here in Hawaii, but what it means is that on average, our community is college educated, they're business owners, they have access to assets, they have relatively stable income. And that's for a few reasons. One, we're a small community, so just the number of people here is pretty low. So the average is going to go up if there are people who are particularly high earners. But also, as we all know, living here, the cost of living is very difficult, is very high in Hawaii. It's difficult for people to move here if they don't already have roots here. And so people who have made their homes here, whether they're born and raised here and stay, or have come to Hawaii from our Black community, are usually people who have a good socioeconomic stability, right? When we control for class and socioeconomics, the only thing that explains the differential that we see between babies of Black mothers and everyone else is race. And as we have been doing our own kind of investigations around this in our community, we hear countless stories of medical racism and the dismissal of concerns that Black mothers have. And so we have this astronomical rate of infant mortality. And some of those numbers have come down a little bit, but it's quite high considering that we're looking at people who, by all other means, should have access to quality healthcare. And it's also interesting when we look at the fact that Samoan community is right next to the rate in the Black community. There's a different kind of socioeconomic profile on average for Samoans here in Hawaii, but the same kind of experiences of racialization and medical racism we hear throughout those communities as well. And so race is really important to help us explain what's going on here. And I think it's really imperative for us to look at that if we're going to make Hawaii a better place for all of us. Some of you may have seen this New York Times article a couple of years ago, written by a science writer who was very intrigued by the fact that there are lots of people of mixed race here in Hawaii. And he wrote this very long piece suggesting that if people wanted to be less racist, they should come here and spend time here. I'm not going to belabor this particular article. If you're interested, you should check it out. It's interesting to see how someone from outside our community framed this experience. But what is really important for me and this conversation is that this was a huge catalyst for us to be talking about race and talking about what is actually different in Hawaii and what is not different. And the conclusion that this author had was that there was no race here, and that because everyone is mixed race or we come from diverse genealogies, we don't know how to hate each other, and we don't know how to dehumanize each other. And it missed a really big part of the history of Hawaii and the contemporary reality. The hate and hatred is not the only indicator of racial stratification. That's important, but also that it also kind of obscured the experiences of people who are most marginalized by systems of race, including Black folks and Pacific Islanders, and especially including people from the area of so-called Micronesia. So you may know about some of these stories. I'm just going to click through relatively quickly. This history of harassment of Black people here in Hawaii. This is a Hawaiian Air employee who got a sizable settlement after being racially tormented by coworkers for some time, including coworkers who left nooses on his locker at work. Another worker here, an ICU nurse at the Queen's Hospital, also taunted with nooses and racially harassed at work. So while there are a lot of things about Hawaii that are wonderful, we are still living with the reality of these racialized ideas, whether it's the minstrel image that we see of the Queen or the idea that taunting community members with nooses allows you to have power over them. This is something that we have to reckon with, and it's something that's ongoing. And as you can see, something that costs institutions quite a lot of money to actually deal with. It's also important for us to acknowledge the ways that some of the conversations that we're hearing from North America show up here in Hawaii. These are two images of children who were killed by vigilantes in their communities. Trayvon Martin's name you might know because his death in 2012 spurred the Black Lives Matter hashtag, which has moved into a worldwide movement calling for the valuation of Black people and our lives, and calling for very fundamental changes to the relationship between policing and violence in our communities and our daily lives. Interestingly, you may know the story of Starsky Willie, who was killed by a neighbor in Kalihi who suspected him of being involved in a burglary, very similar in age to Trayvon, a young man. A lot of the images of Starsky, just like these images of Trayvon, had them in hoodies, which again became a kind of racialized code. Both of these cases, when we talk about like justice, it's hard to say that there's justice that can be done because young people have been taken from their families and community. But it is interesting to think about the ways that both of these young boys died at the hands of vigilantes who saw them in their community that they shared with their killers, saw them as a Micronesian boy, a Chuukese boy, as a Black boy, as being categorical threats. Whether or not they have actually committed any kind of crime, we don't know that, right? But the idea that the neighbor has the right to exterminate people like this comes from this larger history and larger structures of race and the ways that we are primed to see each other as valuable or expendable. Of course, in recent weeks, we've seen the deaths of, I remember, 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗲 and 𝗤𝗵𝗋𝗀𝗃. These cases are still ongoing. But I mentioned both of these folks just to remind us that some of these larger conversations that are happening in North America have a particular relevance for us in Hawaii. These cases are both very different, and I'm not going to necessarily litigate these cases here, but I do think it's important as we're experiencing a community together to look at the reaction to both of these killings. I may be kind of just in the flow of hearing this stuff because of the work that I do, but there's been a tremendous backlash against Micronesian community members, especially Chuukese people, in the aftermath of the police killing of 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗃. And I know from my small community in the aftermath of 𝗤𝗵𝗋𝗀𝗃's death, we have been targeted and had people mention to us that he deserved it and he was, all the terrible things that you can imagine. Social media is one of the places where these echo chambers get to kind of play out, but none of this would be happening. I'm not speaking about the particulars of these cases in terms of the killing, but I mean the larger conversation. None of this kind of targeting would be happening if there were not an issue of race here in Hawaii. So just being able to contextualize that is really important for us, and also being able to be witnesses to what's happening around us. So, as we're thinking through and trying to kind of reckon with the reality of what's happening here, there's opportunities for us to engage in creating new structures and intervene and creating interventions in the institutions that we're a part of. And I'm not gonna spend too much time going, so I just want to share with you folks that there are lots of resources out there that help you as an individual, as an institution, think through ways that you can contribute to creating anti-racist and truly multicultural institutions that serve our larger community. This one happens to be from an adapted concept from these folks in the lower right corner, if you're curious about finding more details around this. But I share this, and I want to close with this to say that there are lots of ways for us to intervene. Just as race was created by humans, all of our institutions, including the libraries and archives that we work in, were also created by humans. And I think there's a really wonderful and imperative opportunity for us to intervene and to make these institutions that we work for and serve with responsive to our community, and not just turn a blind eye because we don't have the vocabulary to talk about what's happening, but rather have us be really engaged and be engaged in making information available and be engaged in sharing stories that have been marginalized or hard to access. So from there, I'm going to end and would love to talk with you all. I know that there are probably some questions or comments or feedback, and I know Jenny shared some questions previously.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glenn. You really helped us put racism in context with how it developed in the Pacific and brought it into the future, and how it was brought in, all these ideologies and structures were brought into the present time. I just thank you so much for that eye opener. And also, library colleagues, there's an amazing book in the Hawaii State Public Library System that's also based on primary sources. And I think it's out of print now, but it's by Ronald Takaki. The title is Pauhana, and it's talking about how labor developed in the islands. And it also talks about how the sugar plantations were modeled after the cotton plantations in the US South pre-Civil War. So if you want to check that out too. But coming back into the present, and especially with that article that you mentioned, Dr. Glenn, I was wondering if you could respond to the question about how do you respond, or how can we respond to the opinions that Hawaii is just a melting pot, or Hawaii doesn't have a race problem? What would be your thoughts on how to respond to that?
Yeah, well, as I said in my short presentation, I think one of the things is we just have to be real about what's actually happening. When people say that Hawaii doesn't have a race problem, the follow-up is always, well, for who? And what does that mean? What do you expect a race problem to look like? It might not look like the acute violence that we see in, say, a police killing or a vigilante killing in the community. It might look like who is homeless here, and who do we expect to be homeless, and what do we expect for our children? There are a lot of places in education, for example, where there's this effective segregation in our public and private education system in Hawaii. Certain people have access and wealth to be able to support their children in private schools. And then a lot of the kids who are in public schools are those exact children and communities who are racialized. So even just being able to talk about what's actually happening here, I think pushes us to have a different answer to that question of, is there race happening in Hawaii? It is. But it looks different than what we might expect.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's very helpful to be real. I know our time is limited, so I want to turn to some of the library specific questions that some of our registrants had put in. There was one, how are libraries able to encourage change in their communities in regards to systemic racism? And have you ever witnessed libraries as receptacles of systemic racism? We talked a little bit about institutions, so love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, and I have to put a caveat that I'm not a library professional, though in my work as a linguist and as a scholar, I've relied on the skill and the commitment of amazing librarians and archivists, and I mentioned some historians and others who have been really influential in my work. I think the question of what responsibilities there are for libraries, I think, is really up to the individual institutions and their capacity. But I will say that being institutions that people respect as sources of knowledge can go a really long way. Being able to highlight stories that are otherwise inaccessible to communities can go a really long way. And I'll share one brief story from a couple of years ago in working with some librarians in Kahuku, and I don't know if they're even on the call today, but a group of librarians, it's a Kahuku Public and School Library, I believe is their configuration. They were really interested in looking at the history of Black soldiers who were stationed in Kahuku. So again, there was this long oral history project that was initiated by several people and carried out by Dr. Catherine Takara, who lives in Ka'ava, and she spent a lot of time with Black soldiers who had been stationed in Kahuku, and they talked about all kinds of things that happened during World War II. But one of the things they talked about was the racism that they experienced from people on that side of the island. And some of the librarians at Kahuku were really interested in talking about this particular moment in Kahuku's history, and created, along with Dr. Takara, a very engaging exhibition and several opportunities to talk story. And they left it up for some time and made it available to the kids at the schools there and also to the larger community. So I know from talking to people in the area that they had never heard of this particular history, and being able to see the actual quotations from people in this oral history archive, being able to see some materials and artifacts that were just in boxes left in Kahuku's basement, I think, was really meaningful for them, because it brought concepts of Black history in this particular case into a context that was immediately recognizable. So I would encourage institutions to think about opportunities that you have to share different aspects of your collection, to contextualize them for the community that you serve. And then also just using the kind of gravitas that libraries and the institutions that you serve have in our community to forward some of these conversations. And I think on a case-by-case basis, it'll be a little bit different what that actually looks like in practice, but the potential is there and it's tremendous.
I love that answer about elevating stories that are hidden and bringing them into the light to share with our communities. Thank you. That's really great. And I'm just thinking about all the diverse librarians that are here today, and there's a lot of opportunity there. So thank you for that advice. Okay, 12:55. Okay, I have another question. It's really interesting and kind of relating. How do we as Hawaii-based cultural heritage professionals develop a narrative to hold the diverse histories and cultures that exist in Hawaii without erasing Native Hawaiian history and without invisibilizing, I love that word, about other ethnic groups that have made their homes here?
That's a great question. And then again, I think it will look different on a case-by-case basis, depending on where your institution is situated. But I think the first step is making that commitment and saying, we're not going to talk about the diversity of Hawaii and pretend like Indigenous people are not here, or we're not going to talk about the diversity of Hawaii and only think about communities that have had a certain kind of visibility. I think just having that intention is a great first step. From there, I would encourage people to partner with community members, whether they're already a part of your institution or not. There are people who create and curate their own libraries and their own information sharing. And I think actually having an active relationship and not just a transactional one where you call them up when it's, AAPI month or Black History Month or Filipino Heritage Month or whatever it might be, but actually having an ongoing relationship with community members could go a long way for your own learning. And one thing I love about working with librarians and archivists is that they're always, like me, I think it's one of the ways that we're kindred, is that we're always interested in learning. We want to know more. We want to see new connections. Yes, maybe we're interested in categorizing and organizing things, but we're also really interested in the ways that things connect together. And I think having that intention guide your work, especially around these issues of marginalization, will only help you build better, more robust programming for the community, but also making the materials and information more available.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think we have time for one more, and we can close with this one, I think, and it relates to everything that we've been talking about. But how can we be good allies working in the public library system? So I think this came from a public librarian, but a lot of us are open to the public, even if we're a special library.
Yeah. Well, I think the last two questions that you asked kind of point us in that direction. I always say that when people ask about being allies, really think about what an ally relationship is. It's not just saying, I care about you without me ever having a conversation with you. The concept of ally comes from the theater of war, right? And allies coordinate. They learn from each other, overlapping and compatible interests. If you would like to be have a relationship with community members, that's the first thing that you do, is actually relationship with people who are actively learning and engaging and thinking about how you can use the resources that you have at your disposal to marshal a response. So I would encourage folks who are working in the public to be proactive about your learning about the community that you serve, and really understand who is in the community, not just who comes into the library and who asks you for things, but also why people might not see the institution that you represent as being an accessible place. Think about, I'm a linguist. I love to think about language and what that encodes about our relationships, but thinking about what kinds of materials are available in the languages that are reflective of who is actually in your community, I think is really important. And so, yeah, I would just encourage folks to kind of dig into and root into that professional practice that you have of being learners and connectors, and bring that into how you engage with the people that you would like to serve.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glenn. I know we're just right at time. So there were a handful of other questions, and I was wondering if maybe you and I could together look at them together, and then I could respond to folks later after the program. But I just want to thank you so much for your time, if that's okay. And then maybe could we have access to some of the slides so we can zoom in on some of the copyright, like the notes, so we can find the sources? Would you be okay with that? Okay, thank you so much. Well, on behalf of HLA, we're so thankful for your time, Dr. Glenn. Is there anything you wanted to say before you leave us for your next appointment?
I just want to thank you for the invitation and, sitting through and listening to what I had to share this afternoon. But I'm really grateful to each of you for the work that you're doing and the work that you do for our communities. I think that, folks who are engaged in protecting and making accessible information to our community are really the crux of how we will learn and how we can change our culture going forward. So I want to thank you for the work that you're doing and hope to stay in touch with you going forward as well.
Oh, for sure, Dr. Glenn. Yes, we will be in touch. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you and your knowledge so much. So thank you very much.